That night, Rafael Santoro came home earlier than planned, and he took the service corridor behind the kitchen, a hallway he had never once walked in the 3 years since. The vereen opened on the top floor of a glass tower in the heart of Chicago. He heard the porcelain break first, sharp, dry, echoing between two walls of cold steel. Then came a cry that rose and died in the same breath, swallowed back down the sound of someone who has learned over many months that crying only makes things worse. Rafe took 3 steps around the corner and stopped cold. Under the bleached white light, a waitress in a black uniform was pressed against the edge of a steel prep table. One wrist held tight in the platinum-braceleted hand of Sloane Whitlock. Broken china lay scattered at their feet. The girl did not pull away. She did not call for help. She simply stood there, eyes down, jaw locked, enduring in the way a person only learns after it has happened too many times to count. And the woman Rafe had just put a deposit down on a Wacker Street church to marry was speaking into her face in a voice like cold steel. "That plate costs more than you make in a week. What exactly do you plan to pay me back with?" The bottle slipped from Rafe's hand and shattered across the tile. Both women turned at once. In the 3 seconds of silence that followed, Rafael Santoro, a man this city said aloud only in a lowered voice, a man who could erase an entire family name before breakfast, without getting out of his chair, saw 2 things he would never be able to forget. The first was that he had almost married a woman he had never actually known. The second was lying on a keyring in the broken china at that waitress's feet. A worn brass token, the twin of one he had carried in his coat pocket through 9 winters, which meant the woman standing there with her head bowed was the same woman who had once saved his life, and the thing that had taken everything from her carried his own family name. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, drop a comment, share it with whoever came to mind while you listened, and subscribe to our channel for the stories still to come. But to understand why those 3 seconds of silence carried so much weight, we have to go back a few weeks before that night, to an old warehouse pressed against the river's edge on the west side, where the smell of damp concrete clung to the walls like something that had never learned how to leave. Inside that warehouse, beneath a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, 2 men sat across from each other at a folding metal table. One was Warren Pike, the owner of a construction supply company that had done business with the Santoro family for many seasons. The other sat with his back to the brick wall, the way he always sat in every room he entered, and before taking his seat, he had already counted 3 exits, without anyone noticing that he was counting. Rafael Santoro didn't speak first. He simply placed 3 things on the table, one after another, slowly, like a man setting a place for dinner. The first was a stack of photographs taken at a construction site on the south side of the city, showing concrete blocks that were paler than they had any right to be. The second was a contract already opened to the final page. The third was his own pen, a black steel pen worn smooth along the barrel, laid horizontally across the table with its tip pointing toward Pike. The other man looked at the photographs, and the skin of his neck began turning red beneath his collar. Rafe said 3 sentences. No more. He said that a 5-story building was being raised on the materials shown in those photographs. He said that 40 families would be moving into that building before the coming winter. Then he said that Mr. Pike would sign the last page, would pay out of his own pocket to rebuild the entire foundation, and would never receive another contract in this city again. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't pound the table. He didn't threaten anyone with anything specific. And that was precisely what made it frightening. Because when a man didn't need to say what the consequences would be, it meant both sides already knew exactly what they were. Warren Pike picked up the pen and dropped it. He picked it up again and dropped it a second time. Both times, Rafael Santoro bent down, retrieved the pen, wiped its tip against his own handkerchief, then returned it with both hands, as politely as a waiter serving a familiar customer. On the 3rd try, Pike managed to sign, and when he looked up, Rafe was already on his feet, slipping back into the charcoal wool overcoat that fell past his knees, the coat no one in the organization could understand why he still kept, when the closet at his house was filled with coats that cost 10 times as much. Abel Ferraro drove on the way back. He had been driving for the family since Rafe's father was still alive, and he was the only man permitted to say the things no one else was permitted to say. He asked whether Rafe had finally chosen the opening song for the wedding reception, because Miss Whitlock had asked him about it 3 times in 1 week. Rafe looked through the window, where the lake stretched out beneath a flat sheet of lead-colored sky, and said he would let her choose. She was better at those things than he was. Abel was quiet for a while, then said Mr. Pike would resent him for the rest of his life. Rafe replied that Pike had every right to resent him, as long as those 40 families could sleep safely at night. Then he added one more sentence, more slowly this time, as though repeating something he had committed to memory long ago. He said there was only one rule in this house that he would never negotiate, and that was that no one was allowed to lay a hand on someone who couldn't fight back, and anyone who did would no longer work for him. Abel nodded. He had heard those words so many times that he knew every pause in them by heart, and like everyone else in the organization, he believed that rule was being obeyed absolutely. The following afternoon, Rafe sat in his office on the 47th floor, approving the restaurant's monthly payroll. His eyes moved across the column showing the total amount of service money distributed for the pay period, and he paused for half a second because the figure was slightly lower than it had been the previous period. Then he told himself business was slower this season, and he signed. As his right hand moved across the page, a hard callus showed over the knuckle of his middle finger, the mark of something that had formed a very long time ago and had never softened again. That evening, he crossed the bar area on his way to his private elevator and nearly collided with a waitress carrying a tray in the opposite direction. She stepped back, lowered her head, and apologized, and as she moved away, she quickly slipped her left hand behind her back, in a motion so practiced and precise that it had become pure reflex. Rafe nodded in acknowledgement and kept walking. He didn't look down at that hand. When he reached the elevator, an older woman in a head waitress uniform stepped into his path, called his name, and said she needed to speak with him about something. Her name was Bernadette Kowalski, and she had worked in that building longer than most of the kitchen staff had been in the profession. But at that exact moment, the phone in his coat pocket began to vibrate, and Rafe raised one hand in apology before stepping into the elevator, bringing the phone to his ear as he went. The doors closed between them. Bernadette Kowalski remained standing there for another moment, still gripping the service towel tightly in her hand, then turned and went back inside. The waitress Rafael Santoro had nearly collided with, near the elevator exit, was named Maren Hollis, and that night she was the last person to leave the building. Her shift ended after the kitchen lights had gone dark, after the final tablecloths had been gathered into the laundry baskets, and after the city beyond, the glass had become nothing more than a grid of amber lights stretching toward the lake. She changed out of her uniform in the staff room, sat down on the pressed wood bench, and did what she did every night before going home. She took off her black leather shoes and pressed her fingers into the soles of her feet until the blood began to move through them again. Inside those shoes were 2 layers of insoles, the original pair, and another layer she had cut herself from a pad bought at the drugstore, because standing for 16 hours a day was something no shoe in the world had ever been designed to endure. She removed her service gloves last, folded them neatly into a square, and tucked them into her coat pocket. Her gloves were 1 size thicker than everyone else's on the team, and once, when a new girl had asked why, Maren had simply said her hands got colder than most people's, then changed the subject so quickly that the girl never had a chance to ask anything more. Her car was parked on the 3rd basement level, a silver sedan with far too many miles on it, and the passenger door could only be opened from the inside. She settled behind the wheel but didn't start the engine right away. She switched on the dome light, took the small bills from her pocket, smoothed each one flat across her thigh, and began to count, her lips moving silently with the numbers. On the passenger seat sat 3 brown paper envelopes, all worn soft from being used over and over again, each with a handwritten word in ballpoint pen in the upper corner. The first said rent, the second said utilities. The third had nothing written on it at all, only a tiny dot in one corner, and that was the envelope she filled last, and most carefully, after sitting there and doing the math in her head one more time. That night, the 3rd envelope received less than she had hoped, and she sat motionless for a long while with her hands resting on the steering wheel, before finally pulling away. The key ring in the ignition held 3 keys and 1 small piece of metal, a brass tag worn so smooth that the stamped lettering could only be read when the light caught it at an angle, and it swung gently with the motion of the car all the way south. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor of a red brick building on the south side. The wooden staircase creaked on the 4th step, and she had long since learned to avoid it. Mrs. Delgado from next door opened her door a crack, nodded in greeting, and said the little girl had been very good and had finished her whole bowl of soup before agreeing to go to bed. Maren thanked her, pressed a small box of bread she had brought home from the restaurant into the woman's hands, then quietly opened the door to her own apartment. In the bedroom, beneath the soft glow of a blue fish-shaped nightlight, Poppy lay on her side, one hand still clutching the corner of her blanket, breathing with the deep, steady rhythm that seemed to belong only to children. Marin stood in the doorway watching her for a while, then pulled the blanket up over her shoulders. On the small dining table in the living room, a drawing had been left waiting for her, made on a large sheet of paper taken from a roll of wrapping paper from the laundromat. In crayon, there were two figures, one tall and one small, standing hand in hand in front of a house with a red roof, a chimney, and 3 yellow flowers growing in a neat row beneath the window. In the bottom corner, written in the large, crooked letters of a child who had only just begun learning how to write, were a few words Marin had to look at twice before she could make them out. Our home. She stood there looking at the drawing for a long time. Then she took the 2 strawberry-shaped magnets from the refrigerator door, removed the old picture, and placed the new one exactly where the other had been, right in the center, at the eye level of a 6-year-old child. After that, she turned off every light except the small one above the stove, sat down in the chair in the corner, and took out her phone. She didn't open her messages. She didn't open anything. She scrolled down through a list and stopped near the bottom, at a voicemail she had saved a very long time ago, a little more than a minute in length, with the sender's name listed as Dad. Her thumb rested over the play button and stayed there. She let out a very quiet breath. Then she locked the screen, placed the phone face down on the table, and went to wash her face. Around the same time, about 15 miles north of where Marin was pinning the drawing to her refrigerator, Sloane Whitlock stood beneath a backdrop printed with the names of 4 principal sponsors in a marble-floored ballroom in the Gold Coast and smiled. She smiled at the woman standing to her left, smiled at the silver-haired man on her right, and smiled straight into the camera as the photographer counted down from 3. The flash went off twice. The photographer lowered his camera and turned toward another group. The smile vanished from Sloane's face before the lens had even fully moved away from her, disappearing cleanly and decisively, like a light switch being flipped off. And for the brief half-second between the moment that smile disappeared and the moment she managed to arrange another expression suited to the room, her face was the face of someone calculating how much longer she could hold everything together. She set the untouched glass of wine on the tray of a passing server, thanked him in exactly the same warm voice everyone in the ballroom believed was genuine, then walked toward the corridor leading to the restrooms. She locked herself inside a stall and called the bank. The person on the other end was a young employee, whose voice sounded as though he were reading directly from a screen, and for the 3rd time, he repeated that the loan under the Whitlock family name was now overdue for the 2nd consecutive payment period, that the bank had already sent 3 notices to the registered address, and that if no action was taken within the next 10 business days, the account would be transferred to collections. Sloane asked whether she could speak with the family's former account manager, a man named Halloran, who had worked with her father for many years. The young employee said Mr. Halloran had retired in the spring. She asked if there was any other option. He began reading through a list of debt restructuring alternatives, and halfway through the second one, Sloane ended the call without another word, then stood with her forehead resting against the restroom stall door, and breathed. The phone in her hand began vibrating almost immediately. She looked at the screen. There was no name, only a string of numbers she knew so well she had never needed to save them. She let it ring all the way through once, before answering on the second call. The man's voice on the other end was very low, very slow, and the most frightening thing about it was how completely friendly it sounded, the kind of friendliness an uncle might use when asking how you were feeling over a family dinner. He asked if the party was enjoyable. Sloane said it was. He said he had seen the photographs online, and that the color she was wearing suited her very well. Then he paused, and said this month's payment still hadn't arrived. There was no threat. Not a single word was harsher than the words he had just used to compliment her dress. Sloane said she would transfer the money that very night. The man said he knew she would, wished her a good night, and ended the call first. She remained inside that locked stall for a little while longer, opened her banking app, and had to enter the password twice because her fingers kept missing the keys. The money was transferred under the name of a consulting company registered at an office building she had never once entered. When the confirmation appeared on the screen, she closed the phone into her palm, shut her eyes, and silently counted to 10. Then she touched up her lipstick, pushed open the door, and walked back through the ballroom with the posture of a woman who had never spent a single day of her life worrying about money. She didn't go home that night. She told her driver to take her straight to the tower on Wacker Street, rode the private elevator to the 47th floor, and entered the restaurant after the last guests had already gone. The staff were cleaning up. She walked slowly down the center aisle, looking past rows of tables with chairs turned upside down on top of them, and stopped near the corner by the service station. There, beneath the small light above the counter, A waitress sat on a stool with a soft-cover notebook open in front of her. She wasn't counting money. She was writing. She wrote down the date, the shift, the total amount of service money distributed that night, in small, even handwriting, one figure to each line. Sloane Whitlock stood motionless in the darkness, about 10 steps away, and watched that gloved hand fill one line after another. And something changed in her eyes. Not contempt, but the thing that comes before contempt, and knows very well how to disguise itself as contempt. Fear. From that week on, the restaurant's shift schedule began to change, and it changed in a way that only one person noticed. The weekly roster was posted on the wall of the staff room every Friday afternoon, and then comparing it against the 3 dates circled in pencil in the pocket calendar she carried with her. Those 3 dates were 3 appointments with the guardianship office, meetings she had scheduled weeks in advance, meetings where she was required to appear in person to submit additional paperwork and answer questions. The first week, one of those 3 days suddenly had her name assigned to a double shift. She thought it was a coincidence. The second week, the second date was the same. By the third week, all 3 dates had landed on her shifts, and 2 of them were opening shifts that began early in the morning, something she had never once been assigned during all the time she had worked there. She took her pocket calendar to the management office and asked to speak with Miss Whitlock, carrying the appointment notice with her, and explained in a quiet voice that she was willing to make up any shift, including weekend nights, if she could only switch those 3 mornings. Sloane Whitlock didn't take the appointment notice. She told Marin to come outside and explain it again in the prep area, where the entire service team was folding napkins and the kitchen staff were preparing for the evening shift. And there, in front of more than a dozen people, who kept their eyes lowered to their work while their ears strained toward every word, she said that this restaurant wasn't a place where people could arrange their schedules around personal matters whenever they pleased, and that if personal business mattered that much, then perhaps Marin should reconsider whether she ought to be working there at all. Bernadette Kowalski was folding napkins at the far end of the table. She set the cloth down and began to straighten up. The movement of a woman who had worked in that building longer than anyone else in the room and had decided that she was going to speak. But Marin, without turning her head, without looking toward her, simply reached one hand behind her and closed it around Bernadette's wrist, holding on tightly, keeping her grip there until Sloane Whitlock finished speaking and turned on her heel to leave. That night, after all the guests had gone, the 2 women remained in the staff room with a printed complaint form Bernadette had downloaded from the City Labor Agency's website. Marin did the writing. In her small, even handwriting, she wrote down the dates, recorded every shift change, and documented exactly what had been said and who had been present to hear it. She filled 2 full pages. Then she pushed the form across the table toward Bernadette, and Bernadette signed her name in the complainant's box without asking a single question, because she had understood even before Marin had a chance to explain that there was a guardianship file that couldn't afford to become tangled in any dispute, and because Bernadette herself was nearing retirement and had nothing left to lose. Des Marchetti, the head chef, passed the staff room doorway at the exact moment the pen touched the paper. He saw both women. He saw the form. He saw the way Marin instinctively placed her hand over the corner of the page to cover it. He stopped for half a step. Then he turned away and continued toward the walk-in refrigerator. And for many months afterward, he would remember that exact half step. It happened on Saturday night the following week, when the restaurant was fully booked, and the sound of conversation had risen into a thick layer of noise stretching across the entire dining room. The largest table by the windows had 10 guests, some kind of corporate celebration, and Marin was pouring water for the 4th person when Sloane Whitlock walked over, stepped directly into the aisle, and said in a voice loud enough for everyone at the table to hear that she wanted to inspect Marin's uniform. The entire table stopped talking. Sloane told her to take off her gloves. Marin stood still, the water pitcher still in her hand, and said very softly that she would prefer to remove them in the back room. Sloane said right here. In the silence that followed, Marin Hollis placed the water pitcher on the edge of the table and slowly removed the glove from her left hand, with movements that seemed strangely deliberate, pulling it free 1 finger at a time, as though if she moved slowly enough, none of this would truly be happening. The old burn scar ran from her wrist to the base of her little finger, a strip of discolored skin that had puckered and turned glossy beneath the lights, something the fire had left behind many winters ago and had never taken away. No one at the table said anything. The woman sitting closest to her quietly turned her face away and looked out the window. Marin put the glove back on. She apologized for interrupting their meal, picked up the water pitcher, stepped toward the 5th guest, and continued pouring. Those 3 seconds of silence ended when Rafael Santoro said 3 words, and he said them so quietly that the hum of the exhaust hood drifting out from the kitchen nearly swallowed them. Yet everyone in the corridor heard every syllable clearly. Let her go. Sloane Whitlock laughed. It was the laugh she used at parties when someone told a story that wasn't particularly funny. A laugh so carefully practiced that it could fill any uncomfortable silence, and she released the other wrist as she laughed, letting go quickly, as though she had suddenly realized she was holding something hot. Then she took 1 step toward him and changed her tone, slipping into that warm voice the entire city believed was genuine, and said this was only a personnel matter, that she was handling an incident during the shift, that he had been out all day, and certainly didn't need to concern himself with petty problems in the kitchen. She added that she would take care of it, then reached out as though to touch his arm. Rafael Santoro walked past her. He didn't brush her hand away, didn't look at her, didn't pause even half a beat. He simply moved around the place where she stood, in exactly the way someone would step around a chair left in the middle of a walkway, and her hand lowered uselessly through the air. In the kitchen behind them, the sound of knives and cutting boards had stopped at some point without anyone noticing. Des Marchetti stood in the doorway leading to the prep area, his apron still stained with grease, both arms hanging at his sides. Behind him stood 2 young kitchen assistants, both of whom had abandoned whatever they had been doing. No one had told them to come out. Rafe knew they were there. He could hear them breathing, could see their shadows stretching across the tile floor, and he deliberately didn't turn around and tell them to leave, because over the course of his life, he had learned that a man's words spoken inside a closed room carried almost no weight at all, while the same words spoken in front of 3 pairs of watching eyes became something entirely different. He stopped in front of the waitress, then did something no one in that building had ever seen him do. He lowered 1 knee to the tile floor so that his eyes were level with hers. The hem of his charcoal wool coat touched the floor, falling over the broken pieces scattered there, and he didn't bother to pull it away. He asked if she was all right. Maren Hollis didn't look up immediately. She was holding her left wrist against her stomach, the glove still covering her hand, and a long moment passed before she finally raised her eyes to meet his. In that instant, the man who had sat across from some of the most dangerous people in the city without blinking suddenly realized that he was looking at something he had no tools to deal with. It wasn't fear. He had seen fear many times, in warehouses, across negotiating tables, on Warren Pike's face when he dropped the pen for the 2nd time. This was something else. This was endurance worn smooth into habit, so deeply ingrained that it no longer made a sound. And somewhere far beneath it he saw something so familiar that his chest tightened, though he still couldn't give it a name. She said she was fine. She said those exact words, Mr. Santoro, I'm fine, then bent down and began gathering the broken pieces of porcelain, collecting them into her gloved palm with quick, efficient movements, like someone who had spent so much of her life cleaning up the consequences of other people's actions that her body had learned to do it before her mind had time to think. Rafe reached out and caught her wrist. He held it very gently, only firmly enough to stop her from bending any farther, and told her to leave it. He said it twice, the 2nd time even more quietly than the first. Then, without turning his head, he called Des Marchetti by name, told him to have someone clean this up, and told him to take Miss Hollis down to the staff room and let her sit for a while. Des stepped forward. Only after Maren had gone, only after the sound of their footsteps had completely faded at the far end of the corridor, did Rafael Santoro straighten to his full height and turn to face the woman for whom he had already placed a deposit on a church so they could be married. He didn't say a word, and it was that silence that made Sloane Whitlock, for the first time in 3 years, truly afraid. The next morning, Maren Hollis was summoned to the office at the end of the corridor on the 47th floor. The room the service staff only ever passed by, and no one had ever been invited inside. She stood at the threshold for a moment before knocking. Inside, Rafael Santoro sat in the chair positioned against the far wall, his back to the wall as he always sat, and in front of him was a dark wooden desk, completely bare, except for a check that had already been filled out and placed face down. He invited her to sit. She lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, both hands resting on her lap, the glove still covering her left hand. He told her that what had happened in the hallway the night before was his responsibility, that it had happened inside a building bearing his name and under his management, and that he had no intention of allowing it to pass as though nothing had happened. Then he turned the check over and slid it across the desk toward her. He told her to take a few weeks off, that her position would remain hers, her insurance would remain in place, and that the money was meant to keep her from having to worry about anything during that time. Maren looked down at the check, The amount written there was greater than everything she earned over many months combined. Many times greater than all the money in the 3 brown envelopes on the passenger seat of her car put together. She looked at it for quite a while. Then she placed 2 fingers against the edge of the paper and pushed it back across the desk, slowly, until it stopped exactly where it had started. She said she appreciated it, but she couldn't accept it. Rafael Santoro didn't move. Over many years, men had sat in the very chair she was sitting in and picked up things he offered them with hands trembling from relief, while others had taken them with hands trembling from fear, but he couldn't remember the last time anyone had pushed something back toward him. He asked why. Marin looked up, and her voice wasn't any louder than before, but something in it had changed. She said she came to this building to work. She said that every night she stood on her own feet from the moment the doors opened until the lights went out, that she had never asked anyone for a single day off, except for the 3 mornings for which she already had official appointment notices, and that she received a paycheck because she earned it. Then she said, "What you just gave me isn't wages, Mr. Santoro. It's a way to make what happened last night feel easier for you. And I don't have many things in my life, but I have the work I do, and I don't trade that for pity." The room fell silent. Beyond the glass, the city lay beneath a low layer of pewter-colored clouds. Rafe could hear the air conditioning running through the ceiling, a sound he normally never noticed. He started to say something, and realized he had no sentence that fit, because every sentence he knew had been built for conversations where one person was strong and the other was weak, and this conversation had neither. Marin stood. She had taken 3 steps toward the door when she stopped and turned back. She said she wanted to ask him something. She said that what happened the night before hadn't been the first time, that it had been happening since before Thanksgiving, that through all those months she had still come to work every day, while all those people in this building had kept walking past her, around her, beside her. Then she asked, in that same quiet voice with not the slightest trace of accusation in it, and that was precisely what made the question unbearable. Where had you been all that time? Rafael Santoro opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He thought about the payroll sheet he had approved with a figure lower than the previous period, a difference he had explained away with a single sentence in his head before signing his name. He thought about the left hand a waitress had slipped behind her back near the elevator exit while he had nodded politely and kept walking. He thought about an older woman standing in front of the elevator doors, calling his name, and about his own hand rising in apology before those doors closed between them. Marin Hollis didn't wait for an answer. She thanked him for seeing her, then opened the door and walked out, and the sound of her footsteps gradually faded down the corridor. Rafael Santoro remained alone in that room for a very long time, the check still lying untouched on the desk in front of him, and no one was able to reach him for the rest of that morning. That afternoon, Rafael Santoro summoned the man in charge of building security and ordered him to pull every piece of camera footage from the service corridor dating from before Thanksgiving to the present. The man standing in front of him remained silent for a long moment before answering, and his answer was brutally short. The surveillance system covering the service area stored footage for only 3 weeks before automatically recording over itself. That was the provider's default configuration, and no one had ever asked to change it, because no one had ever imagined there would be a reason to go back and review a kitchen corridor. Rafe asked if there was any way to recover it. The man said overwritten data wasn't the same as deleted data. It had simply become something else. The most recent 3 weeks were intact, but there was nothing in those 3 weeks because Sloane Whitlock had been traveling east with her family the entire time. Everything that had happened before that, every month Marin Hollis had lived through, had already been recorded over by the building's own system and turned into images from other nights. After the security chief left, Abel Ferraro remained in the room. He poured himself a glass of water, drank all of it, then said there was another way, and Rafe knew exactly what that way was. He said the Whitlock family was hanging by a thread, that all it would take was a few phone calls to the right 3 places, and by breakfast the next morning no one would answer a call from anyone bearing that name, and that she would disappear from the city on her own, without anyone having to lay a hand on her. He said Rafe's father would have done it that way. Rafael Santoro shook his head. He said no. He said if he did that, then this would end the way things always ended in this house, with the stronger person winning and no one bothering to ask what had actually happened. And he said that this time he wanted to know what had actually happened. Abel looked at him for a long time, then nodded, and there was something in that nod that looked very much like worry. The next thing Rafe asked for surprised even him when he heard himself say it. He ordered the entire record of the restaurant's service money distributions from the previous 2 seasons brought up to his office. He sat with those records all evening. He wasn't an accountant, but he had spent his entire life reading numbers that people had deliberately arranged to be difficult to understand. And by late that night, he found what he had been looking for. The total amount of service money collected each month had remained steady. The total distributed to the staff had gone down a little every month. The difference had been entered under a line labeled operational consulting fees, and that line pointed to the name of a company he had never heard of. A consulting firm registered at an office building on the northwest side, but that wasn't what made him sit up straighter. The money didn't stop there. From that company's account, every month, almost the entire amount flowed onward to somewhere else. The next morning, Maren Hollis came back to work as though the conversation in his office had never happened. At the end of her shift, she went upstairs to see him, placed her phone on the desk, and said she had something. She told him that one night she had started recording from inside the pocket of her apron, that she had captured less than half a minute before stopping because her hands were shaking too badly, and that she had nearly deleted it many times but never had. Rafe watched the recording. There was almost nothing to see. Only a corner of the ceiling and white overhead lights swaying in and out of frame, but the sound was clear. He listened once and didn't catch it. He listened a second time, then a third, and on the fourth, he stopped at 19 seconds, dragged it back, listened again, then dragged it back once more. Behind Sloane's voice, faint and overlapping with the clatter of dishes, there was a man's voice coming from the phone she was holding on speaker, and that man called her by a name. Not Sloane, not Miss Whitlock. It was an intimate form of address, a word used only in one household. A word Rafe's grandmother had once used for the granddaughters around the table at Sunday dinner, and no one outside the Santoro family used it anymore. Rafe set the phone down. He hadn't even finished forming the thought when the phone in his coat pocket began to vibrate. It was someone from the law office he had asked to make inquiries for him. The person told him that the complaint filed under Bernadette Kowalski's name had indeed been submitted into the system, had been assigned a case number, and had later been withdrawn from the system following a phone call. Maren Hollis stood to leave, and before she went, she said she needed to return her locker key because Human Resources was changing the locker numbers for the entire team. She took the key ring from her coat pocket, removed the small key from it, and while she was doing so, she set the whole ring down on the dark wooden desk in front of him. Rafael Santoro was still holding his phone, and he didn't put it down. He only looked. On that key ring, resting between two tarnished car keys, was a small rectangular piece of brass, its corners worn round, its surface polished smooth by years of rubbing against the fabric of a pocket, and across it were stamped letters so faded they could only be seen when the light struck at an angle. She finished removing the key, slid it toward him, picked up the key ring, and put it back into her pocket. She said goodbye and walked out. Rafael Santoro thanked her, and his voice sounded so normal that even he was surprised by it. He remained still until the door had closed completely. Then he stood, put on his coat, went straight down to the parking garage, and drove himself home, something he hadn't done in many years. His house stood on the north side, overlooking the lake, and he went directly to the study on the second floor, without turning on a light anywhere else. In the bottom drawer of his father's old writing desk, beneath a stack of property papers and a leather-bound notebook no one used anymore, there was a small tin box. He opened it and took out what was inside. He placed it beneath the lamp on the desk and sat down to look at it. It was a rectangular brass tag, its corners worn round, its surface polished smooth by years of being carried in a coat pocket. The stamped lettering had faded too, but he didn't need to read it because he had known every word by heart for a long time. There was the name of a diner. There was the name of a highway. There was the name of a town northwest of the city, a few hours away by car. A town he had driven through many times in his life, and every time he did, he slowed down a little without ever telling anyone why. He placed the tag in the center of the pool of light and sat there for a long time, and in that silence, the night he had spent 9 winters trying not to remember came back on its own, whole and complete, without a single detail missing. It had been the winter after his father's funeral, when he was only 25 years old, and his name had just been placed at the top of a list whose meaning he still didn't fully understand. They told him to get into a car and go meet someone northwest of the city. The car had been on the road for more than an hour when it turned off the highway, and at a dark stretch with no streetlights, they told him to get out. Then they drove away. Snow fell sideways that night, not straight down, and the wind came hard across the open fields, making it impossible to tell where the sky ended and the ground began. He walked along the edge of the road without gloves and without a hat, and after a while he could no longer feel either of his hands. He saw a light in the distance and walked toward it because it was the only light still burning anywhere along that stretch of road. It belonged to a small roadside diner, with a row of stools along the counter, and a sign outside whose lights had gone dark. The door was locked. He knocked. A very young woman, her hair tied at the nape of her neck, still wearing her apron, opened the door and looked at him through the narrow gap, then opened it wider, without asking a single question. She brought him inside, pulled out a chair for him beside the heater, poured him a cup of hot coffee and placed it between his two hands, then went into the back room and returned carrying a charcoal wool coat that fell past the knees, neatly folded and still smelling of laundry soap. She said it belonged to her father and told him to wear it. About 15 minutes later, 2 cars pulled into the parking lot out front, their headlights sweeping across the windows. The young woman told him to stay in the kitchen. She went to open the door, and when the 2 men asked whether she had seen anyone walking along the road, she stood there with a dish towel in her hand and said yes. A little while ago, a man had been walking north. She pointed north. She lied so smoothly that no one in the world could have doubted her, and the 2 cars turned around and headed north. When he left near dawn, he gave her all the money he still had in his pocket, and she pushed it back toward him, then slipped a small brass tag into the pocket of the coat and said that the next time he came by, breakfast would be free. Rafael Santoro returned to the present, to the lamp, to the wooden desk, to the 2 identical brass tags lying side by side in front of him. He could have called her right then. He could have driven south and knocked on the door of that apartment and told her everything in a single sentence, but he didn't. He sat there in silence, and the reason he remained silent was that a question had just appeared in his mind, a question he didn't want to ask, a question about where that diner was now, and why a young woman who had once had an entire roadside diner was now standing 16 hours a day in his restaurant. One Sunday afternoon, after the snow had melted across the city and the front steps on the south side gleamed beneath the pale sunlight of early spring, Rafael Santoro parked half a block away from the red brick building and remained sitting in his car for a while. On the seat beside him was a document envelope containing certified copies of payroll records and employment verification papers, the documents the guardianship office had requested, and the documents Human Resources should have mailed. He had told them not to send them. He picked up the envelope and walked over. The wooden staircase creaked on the 4th step, and he didn't know to avoid it. He knocked on the door. It opened, and the person standing there came only to his waist, her hair tied into 2 pigtails, wearing an adult apron wrapped twice around her body, with a streak of white flour across the bridge of her nose. The little girl looked up at him, neither frightened nor surprised, merely tilting her head as she studied him. From the kitchen, Marin called out to ask who it was, and the girl turned her head and shouted back that there was some man at the door, then turned to Rafael again and asked if he was the man who had come to fix the faucet. Rafael Santoro said he wasn't. The girl said that was too bad, then reached up, took hold of 2 of his fingers, and pulled him inside. He let himself be pulled. In the kitchen, Marin was standing over a large bowl, with both hands buried in dough, and when she saw him, she straightened in surprise, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear with her elbow, and said she hadn't known he was coming. He raised the envelope and said he had brought these papers over. That was all. He simply didn't want them sitting in the mail for several more days. She thanked him and started to wipe her hands so she could take them. But the little girl had already tugged on his hand again, pulling him toward the refrigerator and saying that he had to look at this first. The refrigerator door was covered in paper, from the bottom almost all the way to the top, with strawberry-shaped magnets everywhere and neatly cut squares of wrapping paper from a laundromat. There was a purple cat. There was a school bus with far too many wheels. There was the house with the red roof and 3 yellow flowers growing in a neat row beneath the window. And right in the middle, pinned at the eye level of a 6-year-old child, was a newer sheet of paper, the wax crayon still bright in the heavier strokes. On it was the drawing of a man. He had been drawn taller than every other figure in the picture, so tall that his head touched the upper edge of the paper, wearing a long gray coat that reached his knees, and holding a long black object in one hand, with one end split into 2. The little girl pointed at him and announced that this was the fixer man. She said the fixer man could fix everything. She said the fixer man had a long coat just like his, then looked up at the hem of Raphael's charcoal wool coat and nodded with satisfaction, pleased to have confirmed her own observation. Marin wiped her hands on a towel and came to stand behind them. She said softly that the little girl drew every man she cared about that way, that she drew the building electrician that way, the owner of the grocery store at the end of the street that way, even the mailman that way, because in her mind, Every good man carried a wrench. She said it with a trace of laughter in her voice, the kind of laugh belonging to a single mother who had grown used to explaining her child's small peculiarities to strangers. Then she realized that the man standing in front of the refrigerator wasn't saying anything. Rafael Santoro stood there with the document envelope still in his hand, staring at the drawing, and didn't move. He had sat across from men who could have taken his life without blinking. He had stood in rooms where everyone knew exactly who the most powerful person was, and no one needed to say it aloud. But he had never stood in front of a refrigerator in a small kitchen on the south side, looking at a 6-year-old child who had drawn him as a man capable of fixing everything, and found himself with nowhere inside his body to put the feeling rising through him. The little girl tugged on his coat and asked if he liked it. It took him quite a while to answer, and when he finally did, his reply was only 2 words, spoken very softly, "I do." Then he placed the envelope on the table, said goodbye to both mother and daughter, and walked out. At the foot of the wooden staircase, he stopped and looked back up toward the apartment door as it closed. And inside the pocket of his coat, his fingers tightened around a small brass tag he still hadn't told anyone about. The family council meeting took place on Wednesday evening in the private room behind the restaurant. A windowless room with nothing but a long walnut table and 8 chairs, and by custom the service staff were only allowed to enter and clean after everyone had left. The 8 men took their seats in the same order they had followed for many seasons. At the inner end of the table, with his back to the wall, sat Rafael Santoro. At the outer end sat his uncle, Otto Santoro, a 61-year-old man with white hair combed straight back and broad hands resting neatly on the tabletop. A man who always arrived 15 minutes before everyone else, and was always the one who poured the wine for the entire table. There was exactly 1 bottle of wine and 8 glasses on the table. No one had brought anything else. In this world, when someone carried something into a council meeting, it meant things had already gone wrong before the meeting even began. And that night no one had brought a thing, which was precisely what made what was about to happen even more frightening. Otto poured the wine, asked after the 2 men whose children had recently started college, told an old story that made 3 of them laugh, then set down his glass, and said he had something he wanted to put before the table. He spoke very slowly, very gently, in the voice of an uncle who sounded genuinely concerned. He said he had been hearing troubling things over the past few weeks. He said a supply contract had been canceled halfway through and had forced 2 construction sites to shut down. He said there was a meeting with the city that his nephew had postponed twice. Then he said he wasn't blaming anyone. He simply believed that when the man at the head of the family allowed the matter of a waitress in the kitchen to occupy all his thoughts, that was when the rest of the house needed to sit down and ask themselves whether the right man was still sitting in the chair at the head of the table. He didn't look at Rafe when he said it. He looked down into his wine. Then he proposed a vote to transfer control of the 3 main areas of the business to a 3-man council on a temporary basis. And he made it clear that this would only be temporary, only until things had settled down again, and that he himself would be the happiest man in the room if his nephew proved there was no need for it. The room remained silent for a very long time. Rafael Santoro didn't say a single word in his own defense. He simply sat there with his back to the wall, both hands resting on the table, and looked into the eyes of each man in turn, moving slowly around the table, missing no one, lingering on no one for too long. When the vote was called, 4 men raised their hands in favor. 3 did not. With the vote of the man sitting at the head of the table, the proposal failed, and it failed by exactly 1 vote. Otto Santoro smiled, said that was wonderful, that he had always believed in his nephew, then raised his glass to the table and drank it empty. The meeting ended close to midnight. Maren Hollis had been assigned to clean the private room that night, because she was the last person still there. She opened the door to a room still heavy with the smell of wine and cigarette smoke caught in the curtains, stacked the 8 glasses on a tray, gathered the napkins, and when she pulled out the chair at the outer end of the table so she could wipe the surface, something fell onto the carpet with a very small sound. She bent down and picked it up. It was a scratched metal lighter with a flip top, so old that the plating at the corners had worn away completely and exposed the reddish brass beneath. She was about to place it on the table, so whoever owned it could come back for it. But when she turned it over in her palm beneath the ceiling light, she saw a faint engraving on the case, a very simple symbol she hadn't seen in many winters, and her hand stopped in midair. It was an arrow enclosed inside a narrow circle, the same mark the men who used to stop at her father's roadside diner would leave on receipts, stamp into belt buckles, and carve into lighters. She had seen it dozens of times when she was an 18-year-old girl pouring coffee for cars that pulled in before dawn. She had seen it, and she had forgotten that she had ever seen it. Until this exact moment. Maren Hollis stood alone in that windowless room for a very long time, the lighter resting in her gloved palm. Then she did something no one had asked her to do, and no one would ever know she had done. She took out her phone, placed the lighter on the table beneath the light, and took a photograph of the engraving. 3 nights later, Maren Hollis finished her shift later than usual and went down to the 3rd basement level the way she did every night. Poppy was at Mrs. Delgado's apartment, had already eaten dinner, and was watching cartoons. Mrs. Delgado had texted her that earlier in the evening. At that hour, only about 10 cars remained scattered through the garage. The ceiling lights were the old yellow kind, casting a dull glow that made every color look almost the same, and somewhere behind the concrete columns, water dripped steadily into a puddle. She heard the footsteps when she was still about 20 paces from her car. They weren't the footsteps of someone walking toward their own vehicle. They were the footsteps of someone walking toward her. The man was heavy-set, wearing a canvas coat and a knit cap pulled low over his head, and he called her by name, called it naturally, as though the two of them knew each other. He said he only needed the phone, that she should hand it over, and then they could both go home, that there wasn't going to be any trouble. Maren Hollis didn't run right away. She took 1 step backward and slipped a hand into her coat pocket. Then she pulled out her keyring and threw it hard over the hood of the car parked to her left, and the cluster of metal struck the concrete on the other side with a loud clatter that echoed through the empty garage. The man turned his head toward the sound, only for a moment, only as long as a single breath. Maren was already running in the opposite direction. She didn't run toward the elevators because they were too far away. She ran toward the 2nd concrete column from the entrance ramp, the column she passed every night and saw every night without ever thinking about it, the one with a red glass box mounted at shoulder height. She smashed the glass with her gloved elbow and pulled the alarm lever down. Sirens erupted through all 3 basement levels at once. Sharp and absolute. Emergency lights flashed bright white at every exit, and at the top of the ramp, the rolling door leading to the street began lowering automatically as part of the system. The man froze in the middle of the lane, surrounded by the alarm, and in that exact instant, the headlights of a car coming down the ramp swept across him. The car stopped sideways across the lane. Both doors opened at the same time. What happened next lasted about 3 seconds. The man turned to run toward the emergency exit, but Abel Ferraro was already standing there with both arms hanging loosely at his sides, and when the man changed direction, Rafael Santoro was already beside him, one arm lifting to catch the swinging wrist, one foot pivoting, and the other man lost his balance, stumbled against the car door, then slid down until he was sitting on the concrete, with the knit cap fallen from his head. No one struck anyone. The alarm was still screaming. Abel stepped forward, silenced it with a management key, and in the sudden return of quiet, he took the car keys from his pocket, separated one small key from the ring, and held it out toward Rafe. It was the trunk key. No one in that garage needed an explanation for what the gesture meant. The man sitting on the ground was named Gus Weaver, and he understood immediately because he had lived in this world long enough, and for a moment he stopped breathing. Maren Hollis stood about 10 paces away, one hand still braced against the concrete column. The entire garage waited. Rafael Santoro looked at the key in Abel Ferraro's hand. Then he didn't take it. He walked over to Gus Weaver, bent down, and told him to stand up. The man rose slowly, suspiciously, his shoulders drawn tight. Rafe picked up the knit cap from the floor and handed it back to him, then reached out and brushed the concrete dust from the shoulders of his canvas coat, twice, carefully, the way one man might straighten another man's collar before seeing him out the door. He told him to go home, and when he got there, to tell the person who had hired him one thing. He said the Santoro house had a new rule, that from now on, anyone who laid a hand on someone who couldn't fight back would no longer have a place in this city, and that the rule applied to everyone in the house, without exception. Then he stepped back and left the path clear. Gus Weaver didn't believe him. He walked 3 steps, looked back, then kept going. Abel Ferraro watched him leave, and when the man's figure disappeared at the top of the ramp, he said quietly that Rafe's father would never have done that. Rafael Santoro said he knew. Then he added that this was exactly the reason. But at the top of the ramp, beneath the emergency lights that were still glowing, Gus Weaver stopped one last time and turned around. He looked at Rafe for a long moment, then said something almost casually, the kind of thing a man says after being spared and wanting to give something back when the only thing he has to offer is a piece of information. He said, "You really are different from your father." The old man never went easy on anyone along the highway route back then. Then he left. Rafael Santoro stood motionless in the middle of the garage, and for a very long time, he didn't move. The next morning, Abel Ferraro drove alone to a warehouse on the west side of the city, where the family kept the papers no one wanted to remember anymore but no one dared burn. He had a key, because he was the only man still alive who had been storing things there since the days when Rafe's father was still living. Inside, it was cold and dark, with iron shelving as tall as a man arranged in long rows, each shelf holding cardboard boxes with yellowed, handwritten labels, sorted by season and by district. He walked along the fourth row and stopped at the section marked for the northwest routes. He pulled down 3 boxes, placed them on the wooden table beneath the only light that still worked, and began to read. He read all morning. The pages were written in a language that would have meant almost nothing to an outsider. Ledgers listing only street names, route numbers, monthly collections, and a narrow column on the right for status notes. Most of the lines in that column were blank. A few said paid in full. Others said suspended. Near the end of the file from the winter Rafe's father died, he found the stretch of highway that ran through the town to the northwest, and he traced his finger down the list of businesses along that route. There was a gas station. There was an auto repair shop. There was a 12-room motel. And there was a small diner, its name written in capital letters, with Walter Hollis listed as the owner. And in the status column beside that line were 4 handwritten words Abel Ferraro read over and over until the 6th time. They said matter has been handled. He turned the page. There was a shorter record there, only a few lines, the kind of paper the family had always called a closure report, and it stated that the business in question had ceased operating, that the property had been placed up for auction because of unpaid taxes, and that the route had been closed indefinitely due to the risk of outside attention. At the bottom of the page, in the box reserved for approval, there was a signature. It was small, slanting to the right, with a long hooked stroke descending from the final letter. And Abel Ferraro had seen it on thousands of documents over the course of his life. It was Otto Santoro's signature. He placed the paper on the table. Then he sat still. He remained in that cold warehouse for a very long time, long enough for the light above him to begin buzzing, and during that time he understood the entire shape of what had happened without needing to read another page. The fire at that roadside diner had never been an electrical accident. It had been a message. It had been sent to the person who had stood in the doorway of the diner during a snowstorm and deliberately pointed 2 cars in the wrong direction, and it had been sent a few weeks later, after the men in those cars had pieced everything together and realized they had been lied to their faces by an 18-year-old girl holding a dish towel. It happened during the winter, when Rafe's father had only just been buried, during the months when the name Rafael Santoro had merely been placed at the top of a list, while the real power still rested in the hands of the man who sat at the outer end of the table, the man who poured wine for everyone and always arrived 15 minutes early. And that route had been shut down immediately afterward, not because anyone regretted what had been done, but because someone was afraid of attracting attention. Abel Ferraro knew exactly what would happen if that paper left the warehouse. He knew it wouldn't stop with Otto. He knew it would pull in the 4 men who had raised their hands at the Wednesday night meeting, and perhaps the 3 who hadn't. He knew it would bring an end to something 3 generations of men had spent their lives building. And he knew the person who would have to pick up that paper was the same boy he had once driven to school on winter mornings, when the boy's father had been too busy. He could have left the paper in the box. He could have returned all 3 boxes to the iron shelves, locked the warehouse, driven home, and no one in the world would ever have known he had been there. He sat for a little while longer. Then he folded the paper in half, slipped it into a yellow envelope, tucked it inside the breast pocket of his coat, returned the 3 boxes to the shelves, turned off the light, and locked the door. That afternoon, he drove to the tower on Wacker Street, went up to the 47th floor, knocked on the office door at the end of the corridor, placed the yellow envelope on the dark wooden desk in front of Rafael Santoro, and didn't say a single word. Rafael Santoro kept the yellow envelope in his coat pocket for 2 full days. He carried it with him to meetings, carried it home, set it down on the table and picked it up again. And during those 2 days, he thought through every possible way a man could choose never to say something aloud. He could burn the paper, and no one in the world would ever know. He could move her into another position at 3 times the salary, pay every dollar of the little girl's tuition, buy the 2 of them a house somewhere with a front yard, and she could live the rest of her life without ever knowing. He calculated all of it. Then on Friday night, he drove south and parked in front of the red brick building. And when Marin Hollis came down to open the door, he didn't step inside. He said he needed to tell her something. And he said it wasn't something that should be said in the apartment. She looked at his face and didn't ask another question. She went back inside to get her coat, stopped next door to say something to Mrs. Delgado. And then the two of them sat outside on the brick steps in front of the building beneath the hallway, light shining through the frosted glass. There was no wind that night. Rafael Santoro didn't circle around the truth. He took out the envelope, but he didn't hand it to her right away. He told the story first. He told her about that night in the snowstorm, told her that the man who had stood outside the diner and knocked at the narrow opening in the door had been him, that the cup of hot coffee placed into two hands that could no longer feel anything had been poured by her, that the charcoal wool coat he had worn every day through 9 winters was the same coat she had brought out from the back room, folded neatly and handed to him. Maren Hollis sat still. She didn't say anything. Then he kept going, and this time he spoke more slowly. He said the 2 cars that had pulled into the parking lot that night belonged to men from his own house. He said that a few weeks later, they had pieced everything together. He said what happened to that diner wasn't faulty wiring, wasn't an accident, wasn't what the official conclusion had claimed. He said it had been done deliberately, and it had been done as a message to the person who had stood in that doorway and pointed them in the wrong direction. Then he said the final part, and he said it looking directly into her eyes, that it had happened during the winter his father had just died, when his own name had only recently been placed at the top of a list he still didn't understand, and the person who had approved it was his uncle, the same man who was still sitting at the outer end of the table in the windowless room at the restaurant where she worked. He set the envelope down on the step between them. Maren Hollis didn't pick it up. She didn't scream. She didn't stand. She didn't raise a hand to cover her face. She simply sat there looking down at the 2 hands resting in her lap, one gloved and one bare, and she stayed that way for a very long time. Somewhere at the far end of the street, a car passed. In the building behind them, water ran through a pipe, then stopped. Rafael Santoro didn't say another word, because he had lived long enough to know that there were silences in this world that it was cruel to fill. At last, when she spoke, her voice was so quiet that he had to lean closer to hear her, and she didn't ask who had done it. She didn't ask why. She asked whether, if she had pointed in the right direction that night, if she had pointed south instead of north, if she had simply told the truth the way an ordinary person would tell the truth, would her father still be alive? She asked, was it because of me? Rafael Santoro didn't answer. He wanted to say no, of course not. Not even the smallest part of this was her fault. But he knew that if he said those words now, they would fall like a coin dropped into a deep well, never reaching the bottom, changing nothing inside the woman sitting beside him, and worse, they would make her do the thing she had done all her life, nod and say she was fine so someone else could feel better. So he said nothing. He moved down 1 step so that his shoulder was level with hers, and he stayed there. That night, Maren Hollis cried, and she cried the way someone cries after learning long ago that no one is supposed to hear it. Her shoulders didn't shake. There was no sound, only tears running down her face and falling onto the back of her gloved hand. Rafael Santoro didn't reach out to hold her. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder. He simply sat there, close enough for her to know someone was there, far enough away that she didn't have to perform for anyone. At one point, he took off the charcoal wool coat and laid it across her shoulders, and she left it there. One by one, the lights in the apartments above them went dark. The brick steps beneath them grew colder, and they sat that way until the sky began to turn the pale gray that comes just before dawn, neither of them saying another word, with one question still lying between them, unanswered. By the time the sky had fully brightened, and the first people in the building had begun coming down the stairs on their way to work, Maren Hollis was still sitting on that front step with the wool coat around her shoulders, and she said that she had something she needed to tell him too. She said she would say it now, because if she waited until another day, she knew she wouldn't be able to say it at all. Then she told him. She told him that after that night, her father spent an entire season in the town hospital, that he woke a few times and then stopped waking, that they transferred him to long-term care, and that every week another bill was mailed to the address of a house where no one lived anymore. She told him that a man in a suit came to see her in the hospital corridor. He was very polite. He said he represented the insurance company, that the cause of the incident was still being determined, and that the process could take a very long time, perhaps 2 years, perhaps longer, and that during that entire period there would be no payment of any kind. Then, he placed a typed document on the table, and one line stated that the cause had been determined to be a failure in an aging electrical system, and he told her that if she signed there, everything would be settled within 10 days. Maren Hollis said she didn't sign it right away. She said she took the paper home, kept it in her bag, and carried it with her to the hospital every day for 3 weeks. Then she said that one afternoon she was called into the finance office and told that if no payment was made by the following week, they would have no choice but to transfer her father to a state facility nearly 100 miles away. She said that night she sat in the hospital corridor beneath lights that never went out, and she signed. She said her father lived another 7 weeks after that, and during those 7 weeks he never woke again, and the night nurse was the only person besides her who knew that a paper had been signed. Then she said the sentence she had carried inside herself through all those seasons, and she said it in such a calm voice that it was harder to hear than if she had been crying. She said he had refused them while he was still able to speak. She said she was the one who had sold the truth he had held on to, sold it for 7 weeks, and that ever since then she had never once dared speak up in front of anyone with power because she didn't feel she had the right. Rafael Santoro listened to all of it. He didn't tell her that what she had done was right, and he didn't tell her that it was wrong. He only said that her father had lived another 7 weeks, and during those 7 weeks, someone had sat beside his bed every single day. A few days later, Bernadette Kowalski found Marin in the staff room after the afternoon shift. She had heard that the complaint filed under her name had once been submitted and then withdrawn, and for weeks she had been thinking the same thing anyone in her position would have thought, that the person who had written the complaint was also the person who had withdrawn it, that she had signed her name to something and then been left alone with it. She said exactly that, her voice trembling with anger. Marin didn't defend herself. She simply opened her bag, took out the pocket calendar, turned to the page with the 3 dates circled in pencil, and placed it on the table for Bernadette to see. Then she said that she wasn't allowed to let her name appear on any dispute record until the confirmation hearing was finished, and that she had asked Bernadette to sign in her place not because she wanted to hide behind her, but because she had no other choice, and that if Bernadette didn't want to look at her again after that, she would understand. Bernadette Kowalski stared at those 3 circled dates for a long time. Then she sat down beside her, took Marin's gloved hand between both of her own, and said that next time, she should just tell her from the beginning because she was 63 years old and far too old to be surprised anymore. That evening, before the doors opened, while the entire service team and kitchen staff stood in line listening to the shift assignments as they did every night, Des Marchetti stepped out of his place and said he wanted to say something. He said he had known. He said he had walked past the staff room door on the night the complaint was written, that he had stopped for exactly half a step and then kept walking, and that for many months before that he had seen plenty of other things and said nothing. He said he had been afraid of losing his job, and that he had told himself it wasn't his business, and that he had been wrong. Then he turned toward Marin Hollis and told her he was sorry. No one applauded. No one said anything. The entire room simply stood still, and inside that silence, something had finally been set down exactly where it belonged. Rafael Santoro found Sloane Whitlock at the high-rise apartment overlooking the river, the place she had moved into after her family home was sold, without anyone in her social circle ever finding out. She opened the door and didn't seem surprised. She wasn't wearing makeup. Her hair was tied at the nape of her neck. She wore a long-sleeved sweater, and in the living room behind her, 3 cardboard boxes had been stacked neatly along the wall. She invited him in. Rafe didn't sit down. He placed the printed records of the restaurant's service money distributions from the previous 2 seasons on the table, already open to the page, containing the line marked operational consulting fees, and he said he hadn't come to ask whether she had done it because he already knew. He said he had come to ask where the money went afterward. Sloane Whitlock looked at the paper. Then she sat down on the edge of the chair, both hands resting in her lap, and began to speak, and there was nothing in her voice of the woman who smiled beneath camera flashes. She said her family's loan had already been overdue long before she met him. She said that during the season, when the bank was preparing to transfer the account to collections, a man had called her father and offered to buy the entire debt for more than its market value, and her father had agreed within a single afternoon because he could see nothing beyond the fact that the Whitlock name wouldn't appear on a public list. She said the man who purchased the debt never asked her father for a single dollar. She said he only called her. Then she said that the first time he demanded that she transfer money, she had asked why it had to come from the employees, why it couldn't come from somewhere else, and he had answered very calmly that any money would do, as long as her name was attached to it. Sloane Whitlock said it took her months to understand what he had meant. She said he didn't need the money. He needed something that grew by another page every month, something with dates, account numbers, the name of the person making the transfer, something he could place on a table whenever he wanted her to do something. She said she had signed her own chain 17 times, once every month, and each time it became a little shorter. Rafe asked whether she had ever thought about telling him. She remained silent for a long time, then said yes. She had thought about it many times, and she hadn't done it, and the reason was worse than anything he was imagining. She said she was afraid of the man, yes, but she was even more afraid of something else. That if Rafe knew someone had a hand around her throat, he would look at her the way people looked at someone who needed to be rescued, and she had spent her entire life making sure no one ever looked at her that way. She said she had chosen to preserve that appearance, and in order to preserve it, she had stood on top of someone who had nothing with which to defend herself. She said she wasn't going to ask anyone to forgive her for that, because she knew exactly what she had done, and because she knew that if she sat there crying now, it would only be one more performance. Then she stood, went into the other room, and returned carrying a document case. Inside were complete copies of every transfer order from 17 months, fully printed, along with screenshots of the calls and the contract for the purchase of the family debt that her father had signed, with the buyer's name clearly written at the bottom of the final page. She placed the case on the table and pushed it toward him. She said she had kept every single document from the very first month, not because she was brave, but because she had known from early on that one day she would need them in exchange for being allowed to leave. Rafael Santoro picked up the case. He didn't tell her he forgave her. He didn't tell her he understood. He only said that she should leave the city, leave as soon as possible, and leave before the name inside that file learned that the documents were now in his hands. Sloane Whitlock nodded. She said she had already booked a ticket. At the door, just as he was about to leave, she called him back and added one more sentence. The only sentence she spoke that entire evening, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, that she hoped that woman would be all right. Then she closed the door. That night, when Rafe opened the case on the dark wooden desk on the 47th floor, he realized something neither Sloane nor he had yet thought through. From that moment on, the paper a young woman had signed beneath the hospital corridor lights all those years ago no longer had the power to ruin anything, because now there were 17 months of documents bearing someone else's name. There was still one thing that didn't fit, and Rafael Santoro knew exactly what it was. In all 17 months of documents Sloane Whitlock had handed over, there wasn't a single line connected to the complaint filed under Bernadette Kowalski's name. There was no call on the same date. There was no transfer made at the same time. He asked the law office to check again, to look deeper, to keep asking until the person there finally had to request permission to call an acquaintance in the records intake department, and 3 days later the answer came back. The system had preserved the phone number used in the call requesting that the complaint be withdrawn, because every call made to that line automatically recorded the incoming number. The person at the law office read the number to him over the phone, slowly, one group of digits at a time. Rafael Santoro stood beside the glass on the 47th floor and listened. He didn't need to look it up. He didn't need anyone to confirm it. The number belonged to the phone that still rested in the breast pocket of the man who had driven him to school on winter mornings when his father had been too busy, the man who had stood in the second row at his father's funeral, the man who had driven him to the warehouse on the west side, the man who had handed him the trunk key in the basement garage, and the man who had carried the yellow envelope with his own hands and placed it on this very desk. He thanked the person on the other end and hung up. He stood there for a very long time. That evening, he called Abel Ferraro up to the office. Abel arrived still wearing the same outer coat worn thin at the elbows, and he stood in the middle of the room instead of sitting down. Rafe didn't circle around the question. He read the number aloud once, then fell silent. Abel Ferraro listened to all of it without blinking, and he said exactly one word. Yes. Rafe asked why. The 68-year-old man stood straight, both hands hanging at his sides, and said that when the complaint had been filed, he had seen it in the system before Human Resources had, because he still knew people there from the days of Rafe's father. He said he had read it and understood immediately what would happen next. He said a labor complaint didn't end with a labor complaint, that it would trigger an inspection of the books, that the inspection would open every stream of money in the restaurant to scrutiny, and that once people began turning over the records of one company in this house, they wouldn't stop with only one company. He said he had thought about Rafe. He said he hadn't thought about the woman who had written the complaint, because he didn't know who she was, and because at that moment there had been only one thing in his mind, keeping Rafe's name out of every file. Then he said he had picked up the phone and called, and the call had lasted less than 2 minutes. He didn't say another word in his own defense. He didn't say he couldn't have known. He didn't say he had done it out of love. He simply stood there and waited. Rafael Santoro asked whether he knew what had happened to that woman during the months after the complaint disappeared. Abel Ferraro said he knew now. Rafe asked whether he understood that if the complaint had remained in the system, Everything would have stopped the previous winter. Abel Ferraro said he understood. Rafe asked the final question, and he asked it more quietly than the two before it. Whether Abel understood that he had done exactly the thing he had spent a lifetime teaching Rafe never to do, that he had stood over someone who had nothing with which to defend herself, only he had done it with a phone call instead of his hands. Abel Ferraro didn't answer that question. He reached into his pocket, took out the car keys, the same ring of keys he had carried since the car had belonged to Rafe's father, and placed them on the dark wooden desk, so gently that they didn't make a sound. Then he said he was sorry, and he didn't say who he was apologizing to. He turned and walked out. The door closed behind him. Rafael Santoro remained alone in the office on the 47th floor, the key ring lying in the middle of the empty desk. While beyond the glass, the city remained lit, exactly as it did every other night, and he realized that the last person still remaining from the family he had been born into had just walked out of his life, and that he would have to finish everything that remained on his own. The transport yard stood at the end of an unlit road on the south side of the city, surrounded by rows of corrugated metal warehouses and stacks of shipping containers, and Otto Santoro went there every Tuesday night to sign paperwork for the fleet. Rafael Santoro drove there alone. He didn't call anyone to come with him, didn't tell anyone where he was going, and carried nothing except the charcoal wool coat, with a small recording device already switched on inside its inner pocket from the moment he left the parking lot. Only one light was still burning inside the yard office, hanging above a table in the corner, and Otto Santoro sat beneath it with a stack of documents and a pen. He looked up, smiled, and said he had been waiting for his nephew to come. Rafe placed the paper on the table, the one with 4 handwritten words in the status column, and a small signature slanting to the right, with a long hooked stroke descending from the final letter. The old man didn't pick it up. He only looked down at it, then pushed the stack of documents aside and began to speak. And what made the entire conversation so terrible was that he didn't deny a single thing. He said the diner had been on the route, and the route had its own rules, that they had gone there twice and asked politely, that the man's daughter had lied to people from this house right to their faces in the middle of a snowstorm, and that if a girl who poured coffee could lie to them and suffer no consequences, then an entire highway route would learn that they could lie too. He said it hadn't been revenge. It had been about keeping order, and keeping order sometimes came at a price. Then he said the next part in the voice of a man explaining a simple calculation to a child who was slow to understand. He said he had done it during the season, when Rafe's father had just died, and Rafe himself didn't know anything yet, that he had done it so Rafe wouldn't have to, and that he had never made him carry any part of it. Rafe asked whether he knew the name of the diner owner. Otto Santoro said he didn't remember, and he said it with complete sincerity. Rafe spoke the man's name aloud. The old man nodded, as though someone had merely reminded him of a small detail from an old story. Then he stood, walked to the metal cabinet behind him, took out a flat wooden box, polished smooth by years of hands, returned to the table, set it down, and pushed it across toward Rafe. He opened the lid. He said Rafe's father would have taken this, and that he had waited many seasons to find out whether his nephew was truly his father's son. Rafael Santoro didn't look inside the box. He didn't lower his head even an inch. He reached out, closed the lid, pushed the box back toward the man standing across the table, and told him to keep it. Then he picked up his paper, put his coat back on, and walked out of the yard office, while the old man remained beneath the single burning light watching him leave, unable to say another word. The following evening, the family council was summoned to the windowless room behind the restaurant. 8 chairs, 1 bottle of wine, and this time no one poured. Rafael Santoro sat at the inner end of the table with his back to the wall, and he didn't begin with any words of his own. He placed the signed paper on the table, then set beside it a written transcript of the recording, and said that if anyone wanted to hear the original, he would play it. No one asked him to. The man sitting closest picked up the paper and read it, then passed it to the person beside him, and the paper made its way around the table, in complete silence. In this world, people accepted many things. They accepted things done in darkness, accepted that there were nights when certain matters had to be handled, matters no one wanted mentioned over Sunday dinner. But there was one thing even the men sitting around that table didn't accept, and it was older than all of them. Older than the Santoro name in this city. You didn't touch people who weren't part of the game. A roadside diner with an aging owner and a daughter who poured coffee wasn't part of the game. The first man to stand was one of those who had voted in favor during the previous meeting. He rose, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out without looking toward the outer end of the table. The second man stood immediately after him, then the third, then the fourth, one after another, No one saying a word, no one pounding the table, no one throwing out some final sentence simply to satisfy his anger. They only stood and left, and each time a chair was pushed backward, the scrape of its legs across the wooden floor echoed through the sealed room like a countdown. When the door closed for the last time, Otto Santoro remained alone at the outer end of the table, with the bottle of wine no one had poured, and 7 empty glasses, sitting very straight, both broad hands resting neatly on the tabletop exactly as they always had. 3 weeks later, the file was transferred to the federal prosecutor's office, and they came for him one morning while fog lay over the lake. The guardianship confirmation hearing took place on a late-season morning in a small courtroom at Family Court, a room with 12 wooden chairs and a ceiling fan turning slowly, even though the weather wasn't warm. Maren Hollis wore the only decent coat she still owned and sat in the front row with the file resting on her lap. The judge went through the documents one by one, asked about housing, about work hours, about who watched the child during night shifts, and she answered every question clearly, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. Then came the witness portion, and the man who stepped forward was wearing a charcoal wool coat, a man no one else in the courtroom knew. Rafael Santoro didn't say he owned the place where she worked. He said that many winters ago, during a snowstorm on the highway northwest of the city, an 18-year-old girl had opened the door of her father's diner to a stranger without knowing who he was. He said she had poured that stranger a cup of hot coffee, given him a coat, and refused to take a single dollar in return. Then he said that stranger had been him, that if that door hadn't opened that night, he wouldn't be standing there that morning, and that he hadn't come as her employer, but as a man who owed her a debt. He said his final sentence while looking toward the judge, that there were many kinds of documents a person could choose to trust, but the most reliable thing about a human being was what they did when no one was watching and no one was paying them. The petition was approved before the lunch recess. When Maren stepped into the hallway, a 6-year-old girl, wearing a dress with pockets on both sides, was sitting on a bench with Mrs. Delgado, and the little girl jumped down and ran the full length of the stone-floored corridor toward her, ran all the way, then threw both arms around Maren's waist and refused to let go. Maren knelt and wrapped her arms around the child, and she stayed that way for a long time, right there in the middle of the hallway, and no one passing by seemed bothered by it at all. At the far end of the corridor, leaning against the wall beside a window, an older man in a coat worn thin at the elbows was waiting. Abel Ferraro didn't approach the mother and child. He waited until Rafe came out, then handed him a thin file clipped inside a paper folder, and said he wouldn't stay long. He said there was something he needed to give him before he left. Rafe opened the file. Inside were the records for a piece of land along the highway northwest of the city, purchased through an intermediary company during a winter many seasons before, and clipped behind them were the complete property tax receipts for every single year, none missing, arranged in order. Abel said Rafe himself had been the one who bought it. He said Rafe had returned to that town in the spring after the snowstorm to look for the diner, and all he had found was an empty lot with dark patches of concrete and a bent metal sign leaning beside the road, along with a tax auction notice nailed to a wooden stake. He said the auction documents listed only the name of a legal entity and no family name, so Rafe had bought the property without knowing whose land he was buying, and he had never built anything there, never sold it, never rented it to anyone, had only paid the taxes every year and left it exactly as it was. Abel said he had been the one signing those papers on Rafe's behalf every year, and that until the previous week, he hadn't known what that empty lot had once been either. Then, Abel Ferraro said he was going to Milwaukee to stay with his sister, that he wasn't asking Rafe to forgive him, and that if there ever came a day when Rafe wanted to call, he would still answer the phone. Then he walked toward the door. That afternoon, Maren Hollis sat at the small dining table in her apartment, with the land documents open in front of her while Poppy slept in the other room. She stared at the paper for a very long time. Then, she took out her phone, scrolled down through the list, stopped at the name near the bottom, and this time, she pressed play and didn't pull her hand away. Her father's voice filled the little kitchen, rough and slow, the voice of a man who had just come home from work. He said, "Sweetheart, I've called you a few times, but I guess you're working a shift." He asked if it was cold and reminded her to dress warmly. Then he paused and said there was something he had been meaning to tell her for a long time and never had. He said he knew she hadn't lost that wool coat. He said he had known since that winter, because only the two of them knew about that cabinet. And he also knew she thought he had been planning to take the coat to the pawn shop, and she had been right. He really had been planning to. Then his voice softened. He said, "Sweetheart, All my life I've sold coffee to people who stopped along that road, and I never taught you anything grand. But that night, when you gave that coat to someone, you didn't ask me first. You didn't wait for anyone to give you permission. You just did it." He said he had been angry with her for an entire winter, and he was sorry for that. He said, "I'm proud of you, you know that." He said, "I'm prouder of you than I am of anything in this diner." Then he said, "All right, I'm hanging up now. Call me tomorrow, okay?" And the recording ended. That spring, along the stretch of highway running through the town northwest of the city, a sign was hung once again above the glass door of a newly rebuilt diner. The lettering on the sign was made of brass, polished by hand, and the craftsman had followed the old photograph exactly as it had been given to him, even reproducing the small underline beneath the final word. The sign bore the Hollis family name and the daughters of that house. The business registration listed only one name, and that name was Maren Hollis. She accepted no investment from anyone. The man in the charcoal wool coat had offered to take care of the repairs, and she had said no, once, and he didn't ask a second time. She took out a bank loan using the compensation returned from the stolen service money, along with the savings she herself had put away over many seasons, and she signed the loan papers alone beneath the lights of a small branch in town. The first person she hired was a man who had just completed his sentence at a state correctional facility and had applied for work at 11 places before coming to her. She hired 2 more men who had recently returned under similar circumstances, then hired 2 mothers raising children on their own in the neighborhood behind the church, and she built their schedules around the hours their children got out of school, rather than around the busiest hours of the diner. Bernadette Kowalski retired at the end of the season and drove up for 2 days every month, sitting on the stool at the end of the counter and teaching the new servers how to fold napkins so they would stand upright. As for Rafael Santoro, he sold the entire transportation division at the end of winter, and he sold it at a loss, because when a man sells under circumstances like those, everyone knows he has to sell. Nearly half the people who had once worked under him left, some going elsewhere, some leaving the city entirely. And there were men who had once called him boss, who now passed him on the street without saying hello. He didn't pretend everything had become clean. He told her that directly one evening on the steps outside the diner, that there were things he had done in his life that no diner and no spring season could ever wash away, and that he could only make promises about the days still ahead of him, not the days already gone. She listened to all of it, then told him that she didn't need a perfect man. She needed a man willing to stay seated. Near dawn one morning at the end of spring, after the diner had closed and the sky outside still hadn't begun to lighten, a man stood beside the sink in the back kitchen, with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, rinsing the final stack of plates from the night shift. Water ran steadily. Out at the counter beneath the small light, Maren Hollis sat on a stool counting the loose bills from the register, smoothing each one flat against the wood, her lips moving with the numbers just as they had many years before, inside an old car on the 3rd basement level. He dried his hands on a towel, leaned against the kitchen doorway, and told her that many winters ago, a young woman had promised him a free breakfast if he ever came back. She said she remembered. He said in that case he intended to collect the debt, 1 breakfast every day for the next 50 years, if she didn't mind. Maren Hollis didn't answer right away. She closed the register drawer, set the diner keys on the counter, and hanging from that key ring were 2 small brass tags resting side by side, both worn smooth around the edges. Then she told him the kitchen opened at 5 o'clock, and anyone who came to eat had to wash his own dishes. Outside the window, the eastern sky began turning pale pink above fields still wet with dew. Beside the front door stood a blackboard, and a child who had woken earlier than everyone else was stretching up on her toes to write the morning menu in white chalk, making the letters large and crooked, spelling one word wrong, wiping it away with her sleeve, then writing it again. And she kept going until the final line sat exactly where she wanted it, before she finally put the piece of chalk down. There are things in this life that aren't returned to us right away, and there are things no amount of money can ever repay. But kindness given on a night when no one is watching continues along its own path, sometimes taking many years before finding its way back. What gives a person value isn't how much power they hold in their hands, but whom they choose not to use that power against, and whether they are able to see the person quietly serving them every single day. If this story touched you even a little, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so we can continue bringing you more compelling stories every day. How did you feel about the story of Maren and Rafael? And has there ever been someone in your life who quietly showed you kindness in a way like this? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a joyful life, and peace in every day that passes. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in the next video.